The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to dotnetcore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Brockman-Taylor, and this is episode 27, Blazored with Chris Sainty. In this episode I interviewed Chris about Blazored and the sheer speed at which the Blazor project has evolved. Some of you may know Chris from his blog at chrissainty.com or the GitHub organization he started called Blazored. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. Thank you ever so much, Chris, for being on the show. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your Sunday afternoon to talk with me because, we're all really busy people. So thank you ever so much.
Absolute pleasure.
Brilliant. For the folks who maybe listen to this show and maybe haven't seen some of the work you do or the blog posts you've written or anything like that, I was wondering, could you give us a quick introduction, sort of who you are, what you do, that kind of thing?
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So I've been a software engineer for a little over 15 years now. Most people will probably know me from my blog, and I've been blogging for just over a year and a half. The blog originally focused on .NET Core, but to be honest, I discovered Blazor, and that's pretty much been the primary focus ever since. I work at Flagship Group, so they're a housing association in the east of England. I work with a great team, and we're building a new greenfield repairs and maintenance solution, which is going to be used by the companies within the group. And what's really cool about all that is we're actually using all of the nice new goodies. So we've got all the new .NET Core stuff, including Blazor for the front end, which is interesting.
Wow, we'll have to double back and talk about that because as we're recording this, MS Build has recently happened, and obviously they haven't released a 1.0. They are jumping straight to 3.0. So I can't imagine trying to get buy-in from PMs and managers and project owners on, hey, here's this experimental technology we want to build your entire stack with.
Yeah, it's normally not something you'll probably even try and do, to be honest, certainly at other places I've been. But I'm quite lucky. Flagship's an incredibly forward-looking company. They're very much about latest technologies, latest advancements, sort of anything we can do to sort of help solve the housing crisis. And I'm, particularly lucky that in IT, I've got a great manager who trusts me and my team to make good decisions. And, he does buy into what we go with. So we talked about it. He's like, do you think it's worth the risk? I'm like, I think it's going to be the big thing. Yes, we're going to have to suffer some pain in the short term, definitely. There'll be some breaking APIs. There'll be some rewrites we'll have to do here and there. But I said, I think if we get on this now, this is going to put us a bit ahead of the curve. He's like, great, go make it happen then. And that's what we did. So, like you say, it's not without its issues. I'm quite happy to admit I spent, 5 days doing an upgrade from Preview 3 to Preview 4, and it was 2 missing using statements.
Wow.
But, the joys of preview tooling. So like I say, I am in a fortunate position that we can use these early technologies. But hopefully they'll benefit us in the long run.
Fantastic. I know for myself, I haven't had a chance to play with the newer versions of Blazor. I think the last version I was playing with was 0.8, I think. And I do a few talks every now and then about Blazor, just sort of introducing it as a technology. I show off an example that I built in the 0.3 initial sort of public release, and making sure that I have an old version of the SDK and runtime on my machine and a global JSON just to get it to run.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it does become a bit challenging if you're trying to keep older stuff going for demos and then the newer stuff and playing around with that. And yeah, I must admit, I've been in the same boat as you a few times, and then I kind of got to the point of like, okay, right, I'm just upgrading everything to the latest version, and I'm going to stick there now because it's slightly less painful.
Brilliant. So, looking at your website, then you said on your about page that you've been in the Microsoft tech stack since the classic ASP days of the late '90s, and you've seen it all grow and change, right? So, this is less of a question about Blazor, but more a question of like the tech stack as a whole. What, in your opinion, have been some of the biggest innovations since classic ASP in that sort of Microsoft tech stack?
Yeah, that's hard. There's been quite a few big steps forward, I think. I think the obvious ones to talk about first is Dotnet Framework and itself and ASP.NET. I think without those, we wouldn't have anything else we've got now. All the other technologies been built on top of that. And I think that was really the dawn of the new tech stack, moving obviously from classic ASP. I mean, C#'s huge as a language, that coming in. There's all the tooling that we've got, which I think is probably one of the biggest selling points of the .NET ecosystem. I think we've probably got the best tooling of probably any ecosystem, although I'm probably a bit biased about saying that. But I think in terms of pure technologies, I think MVC for me was a huge step forward. I started out in the early days with web forms and VB.NET. And, you could build out good applications in web forms. And, the companies I worked for, we did, and they worked, and everybody was happy management-wise, things like that. But, we had issues with maintainability and it was very easy with web forms to write messy applications, I think is probably. And I've certainly done that. I think with MVC, it was the first point for me where the Microsoft stack started to actually embrace the way the web worked. So I think for me, web forms always felt a bit like we're trying to make the web behave like a desktop application. Anybody who's worked with web forms knows the joys of the view state and all of that. Whereas MVC, you had these nice separations of concerns, and it really felt like programming for the web properly. Now, I hope I haven't offended him by saying that, obviously. But for me, that was probably the biggest thing that stands out for me, sort of more historically. Obviously, coming a bit more modern, .NET Core is the obvious thing to say. That ability to have side-by-side runtime versions and the ability to, or the way that then Microsoft can innovate and have a much quicker release cycle and get features out to us as developers much quicker has been fantastic. So, yeah, I think they're my highlights.
So I'm always interested to know whether you think that for the younger devs, so, I think you and I are of a similar generation, a similar age bracket. For the younger devs who are coming in now, is it worth them, in your opinion, knowing that these older technologies like web forms and classic ASP and, old school ASP.NET exist? Or is it just a case of, doesn't matter, just carry on with the brand new shiny, don't worry about how we got here, it's fine?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that one. I think for me personally, I think it's always good to know where you've come from, because I think you can understand then a bit better about where you are now. I think it's probably just a generally good thing to learn from your mistakes. And if you don't know about them, then you can't learn from them. You can't stop yourself repeating them. So I think it's definitely worth younger devs having, I guess, for want of a better way of putting it, an academic knowledge of what happened and where the evolution of the .NET stack sort of came from and how it happened. I don't know. It depends how cruel you're being. I think it could be interesting to give someone some classic ASP and say, go and write me something to do this. And then I think after that, you would never get any complaints about anything newer going forward. But it might be a bit cruel as well. So yeah, like I say, seriously, I think having an idea of where you come from and things like that is good. I think necessarily having to program it just so you can say you've done it is probably not something that's necessary, I think.
I can't imagine the reaction on the face of someone who's a modern Angular or React or Vue developer being given a web forms or classic ASP app and saying, right, yeah, just make this talks to an API and make it do some stuff.
Yes.
You're not allowed to change the stack, just make it do its thing.
Yes, yeah. That would be an interesting one. So I'd be interested to see how much help you'd even get from Google with some of the classic ASP stuff.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Definitely. But yeah, no, certainly from someone coming from an Angular background or something like that, I definitely don't think that certainly given web forms would not be ideal.
And that's fair enough. And that's not to say that, the 20 years of 25, 30 years of applications that are still using ASP Classic or web forms, they don't necessarily need to be in that, inverted commas. There's no need to upgrade or change stack, as long as it works.
Oh, completely. I'm certainly not a believer in changing things just for the sake of it. I mean, I think at the end of the day, most of us, we're writing software for companies. The companies are there to make money and things like that. And frankly, if the app's doing what it should do and can continue doing what it's meant to do, then why change it? I think there has to be a reason, there has to be some benefit for moving forward. And to be honest with you, I mean, I certainly have in my career worked with applications, web forms applications that are still going now they're great. They do the job well. And why would you want to change that? Why, you're likely going to upgrade something and potentially, create bugs or, issues in code that's highly battle tested, highly reliable, highly stable, just to be on something newer. I don't think that's a good reason personally.
Definitely. I think it was in the Phoenix project. There's a quote that's lifted from The Goal by, and I'm going to get the name wrong, Elliot Goldhat or something along those lines, that essentially states that a product, whether it's a physical product like a car or an ephemeral product like software, makes the company no money until it's out there with the customers using it. So flip-flopping on a technology and taking something that's already, has a value and swapping it out for something that may have a value in 6 months' time when we eventually get around to replacing it is maybe not the best idea for long-term survival for a company.
Yes, definitely. It's always done on the idea that it will work out. And I certainly, I can talk from experience on this one, that I've been involved with a product that's upgraded for no other reason than to upgrade. And yeah, it was messy for a while. When I sort of said earlier about, introducing bugs, we did that. And we thought we were doing well. We'd written our unit tests and we were checking everything as we went and it seemed to be all okay. But at the end of the day, every time you change something, there's always a risk that you're going to get it not quite right. And, we had that problem, partly because we didn't really understand the old application as well as we thought we did. You know what it's like, the sort of the old guard who had written it had moved on. And, we were looking at it thinking, oh, yeah, that shouldn't be too bad. We'll just do this and just do that and it'll be okay. And it just doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest problem when you have an application stack that was written by a different team or someone else, and you're either maintaining it or, adding something to it. You need to 100% understand exactly what it's doing. And like you say, if you're not 100% sure, or if the other team have moved on, or if it's not really well documented, it's human nature to make mistakes in that instance because, there's things that you don't know.
Completely, yeah. I mean, it's really surprising because, we as developers are always so good at documentation, But yeah, everything you said there is completely correct. And it's very easy to fall in the trap of thinking you know what something does. Even with us, we were writing unit tests. The problem is our unit tests were correct. We just didn't understand, or they were correct for what we thought it did. So, like I say, just writing tests isn't even, you can ensure quality.
Oh, of course. I mean, I've seen in the past, in actual production code bases, unit tests that simply just assert true.
Yes. I'd like to say I haven't, but I have as well.
It's a good way to start, like if you want to write a unit test that tests something, until that unit test asserts that something is true, it'll be failing.
Yes.
So it's a good way to start to make sure that your unit testing framework is still running.
Yeah, very true. Very true. It's just remember to go back and take it out later on.
That's exactly it. Okay, then. So with Blazor, you've done a lot of writing about Blazor in your own time, presumably a lot of research into Blazor, presumably in your own time, maybe at work's time, I'm not sure. You've also done a lot of work with Blazor, alongside Blazor, that kind of thing. So in your opinion, you said earlier on about, Blazor being a wonderful thing. What's so great about it?
Everything is the answer to that. What's so great about Blazor? Wow, this is hard. Let's try and condense this down. So for me, I think it's the ability to write truly full stack applications as .NET developers. For me, what I sort of usually before Blazor came on the scene, I probably did what was more traditional nowadays, which is kind of I had a web API back end that was all C# and that was all good. And then if I wanted something whizzy at the front end, I would probably have an Angular application. So, in a work sense, that's all well and good. But now I've got a team that needs to have two skill sets. They need to be able to write in JavaScript. They need to be able to write in C#. They need to, understand how those front-end frameworks work. So you're having to keep up with two communities and what have you. But obviously, Blazor removes all of that. Some companies are even having to go to the extent of having a completely separate front-end team because they have entirely different skill sets and things. With Blazor, it's C# all the way through. So now you can take back-end developers and they can write front-end code and it's fine. I mean, that for me is probably the biggest selling point for Blazor. Obviously, on top of that, you've got general just development speed. I mean, certainly my team have found that we're churning out code very, very quickly because, we already understand C# and how it works. So we can write code much more efficiently than sort of dealing with weird nuances you get with JavaScript and things like that. That's another big plus. NuGet. So because Blazor's C# and it's all compatible with .NET Standard and things like that, it opens up the majority of NuGet. So instead of having to wait for an ecosystem to form around a framework, we've already got one and it's massive. Now, obviously, there are a few things we can't use there. So obviously, we're still in the browser sandbox, so we can't go, trying to access the local file system or any of those types of things, or trying to send mail out or something like that. But I think Dan Ross showed in his toolkit build last week, downloading a NuGet package to export some tabular data out to Excel, and you can just go to NuGet, download that package, install it in your Blazor app, and off you go. That's incredible. So they're kind of the big things for me about why Blazor is so cool. On top of that, you've got the fact it's written, it's all open source, it's the new Microsoft, this is all being developed out in the public. The team are very responsive. They listen to the community. They take on board what people say, what they suggest, it gets discussed. A great example of that, I think, was the naming of Blazor. For sort of anyone who doesn't know, things started off as Blazor. And then for a short period, there was kind of this naming issue where another name called Razor Components was brought into the frame. And it really just didn't take. And the community was struggling with understanding things and what have you. And, the team took that on board and it got renamed back, which, that was very much down to the input of the community that drove that. Same with feature requests and things like that. That there's a lot of stuff being taken on board that community suggested things, or they're taking a lot of feedback from the community about how things should work and helping to mold the development experience of Blazor. That's huge as well. I mean, being able to get that kind of input or at least have a discussion with the team about these types of things is enormously beneficial, I feel. When, for a framework that's being built and this early on, to be able to help direct it and have some input, I think is truly phenomenal.
You'd mentioned earlier on about it being, essentially full stack .NET. And I think that's one of the biggest things for me. So, for instance, one of the examples that I show off when I give talks, the example I talked about that runs Blazor 0.3, it uses the Pokemon API, and yes, it's all entirely in the browser. The browser puts out a request from C# side stuff to the Pokemon API, gets a JSON back, deserializes it, I guess, or serialized. I always get serialized and deserialized the wrong way around. But it does some Newton's off JSON. And I get a POCO at the other end. And I literally pass that same POCO to the UI. So now I don't have a C# object that is now out of sync with my JavaScript or TypeScript object. And I also don't need to do anything at compile time to enforce that. I just hit compile, and the compiler, Roslyn, will tell me, hey, this POCO you're trying to use in the view doesn't have a property called ID. What are you talking about? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, the ability to share code between the front end and the back end is enormous. Mm-hmm. The application we're building at work, that's probably been one of the biggest things for us. We use kind of a CQRS style architecture, and we have our commands and query objects, and we have those in shared libraries, and we're constructing commands and in the Blazor app to go up to our API, and that's all shared code, and we're not duplicating it. Like you mentioned previously, having worked with an Angular front end and a web API back end, you have that overhead of keeping TypeScript objects in lockstep with your C# equivalents, and there's always some point where someone forgets to add the property in the TypeScript object or whatever, and you end up having a little bug, and it just costs you a bit of time here and there. Whereas, as you quite rightly said, with Blazor, that's just doesn't happen. The compiler's going to probably tell you before you may not even get to the point of building it before you get an error spat out, which is, that's phenomenally good.
Definitely, yeah. I'm going to throw a question at you that I always get asked when I talk about Blazor, just to see how you respond to it. So the folks who were already at Blazor talk that I gave a few weeks back, as of recording this, will know the question. And that is, but Chris, what's the security implications of running a random DLL in the browser?
Yes, so security. So, yeah, it's something that does come up a lot. But I think the important thing to understand is, as I mentioned earlier, is that Blazor and WebAssembly, they're running in the same sandbox that JavaScript does. So they're just as limited as what JavaScript is. You're not going to be able to access the file system on the the client machine and what have you. You have all those same protections in place. So running Blazor, running WebAssembly on the client is no more or less secure than running JavaScript. So there's no change in risk, I think, is probably what I'd say.
Fair enough. That's a little bit more detailed than the answer I give. Usually I'll say, hey, that code you're running on the server and you're pulling down all those NuGet packages. Have you looked into the code for those?
Well, yeah, that's a good point, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we all know there's been some interesting things with, I think I'm right in saying this, with NPM, with some sort of malicious code finding its way into dependencies and things like that. And yeah, you're quite right. At the end of the day, if you were happy to run it on your back end, then I'm assuming you'd be happy to run it on your front end.
Exactly. And how do I put it? So what I usually say is, you assume that Newtonsoft.json is safe and secure because millions of people are running this on their servers, right? And you assume that it's safe and secure because James Newton King now works for Microsoft, and it's now a .NET Foundation project, and it's developed in the open. But what about that random NPM package you just pulled down? That's developed in the open by reputable people. And this is not to pick on NPM. This is just to say, you can't just say, oh, well, it's okay to run it on the server because it's on the server and I'm not okay with running on the client,
Yeah, definitely. I think at the end of the day, whenever we take on a dependency into our application, if you're taking on someone else's code, you're always taking on a level of risk, and it's up to you as a developer to assess that level and go from there. I guess if you want the most secure code, you could always write everything yourself from scratch, but then we'd probably be taking a lot longer to develop applications.
Definitely. And so let's talk about Blazored then, if that's all right.
Yes.
I know that Blazored is a project that you work on, and I've done some digging into GitHub and had a look, but obviously some of the folks who are listening may not know about it. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Blazored is an org on GitHub that I set up. To be honest, it's something that I set up because I wanted somewhere to put Blazor packages. So I was building a few things out, partly because I knew some of it we'd need at work. So I was sort of doing some preemptive work for that. And sort of really, probably a more primary reason was because I just thought they'd be really useful to people in the community. Yeah, so I set up the Blazored org, put these packages there, started to develop them and put them on NuGet and things like that. And yeah, so it's basically just somewhere to house those packages, and it's really just somewhere as well for anybody who's in the Blazor community who wants to, write a package or put their code somewhere and they don't necessarily want to host on their own GitHub or have enough knowledge to do that, or they just want to do it somewhere where they can get some help from other people and things like that. Blazored is there as an option to help out, and I'm sort of any help that I can give, I will. The more we can nurture the Blazor community, really, the better.
Okay, fantastic. So what kind of packages are available on there? Is it just example code, or is there something that I can pull from there and throw into a Blazor app and, hey, I've got a new feature now?
Yeah, so there's about six packages we've got on there now. So there's a local storage package, which wraps all of the local storage APIs for the browser. So that was one of the first ones I did. That was there because one of the current sort of shortcomings of WebAssembly is that it can't interact with browser APIs or manipulate the DOM directly. So in Blazor, we still have to use a bit of JavaScript when we want to perform those kinds of operations. What the local storage library does is it wraps all of the local storage APIs so that you can just download it as a NuGet package and install that, and then you're only dealing with C# APIs. All of that interop stuff is all hidden away from you. So you don't have to get your hands into any JavaScript stuff. And then on top of that, there's another sort of utility package, which is a localization package. So that uses some interop to try and work out the client's time zone information and sort of localization stuff, and sort of try and give you some information, try and help you deal with that. And then there's sort of three components in there as well. So we've got a modal component, toast component, and a menu component. These were kind of driven a little bit by some of the things I thought we might be facing at work. So they kind of gave me a bit of sort of inspiration for those. And they're also kind of things I think if you're in a front end world and you're, certainly coming from Angular, React, those kinds of places, they're the kind of things that you're going to be using, that you're going to expect to have, certainly, let's say, if you've been using JavaScript. So I wanted to try and make sure that we had the equivalent in the Blazor world that didn't mean having to deal with JavaScript to do these things. So what's quite cool is that the modal, the toast, and the menu don't use any JavaScript at all. So they're generated entirely using C#. There's no abstracted hidden JavaScript interop going on or anything like that. This is just using C# entirely, which, as much as possible, that's what I try to do with the components that are on Blazor, is wherever possible not use JavaScript, because it'd be very easy to just wrap loads and loads of JavaScript packages in C# APIs, but it kind of defeats the object, really. I think for me, what we're trying to do with Blazor, in some cases, yes, there is a valid reason to do JavaScript in the ROC, but I try not to make that the default. The default is let's stay in C#, and then if there's absolutely no way around it, then we'll go to interop. The most recent addition, which is really cool, is actually a Gitter client as well into the Blazor org. So there's a great guy in the Blazor community called SQL Mr. Magoo. He's always creating loads and loads of cool, wacky stuff. And we in the Blazor community talk a lot on the Gitter channel. It's incredibly active. So if anybody does have any issues or questions or whatever, please go to the Gitter channel, because there are loads of great people in there who can help. But one of the things is we kind of, the Gitter client itself, the official one, is a bit iffy, shall we say. So a few of us, I think, we're all kind of thinking about sort of, well, we could maybe write a client in Blazor. But Mr. Magoo kind of actually took that and actually got it started, which I think is the big thing, I think, nowadays, is actually going from an idea to actually starting to code it. Yeah, so he started that going. We're developing that in the moment, and there's a few people from the community getting involved, and they're adding bits and picking up issues and getting them done, and it's a really cool thing. It's kind of the whole reason why I created the Blazor org, was to get people involved and get the community sort of involved, working together and things like that, which is really great. It's great to see that, and I've had it with some of the other packages I've built, where as soon as a new version of Blazor comes out, someone pops up with a PR saying, "Oh, I've upgraded it to the latest version," that's great. That's really awesome, because it's great for me, because somebody's learned something when they're doing it, probably, or they're saving someone else time and effort doing those upgrades.
That's cool. I like it. I've shown off SQL Mr. Magoo's Blattress a few times.
Yes.
And somebody said to me, well, what's Blazor useful for? And I'm like, well, you can play Tetris in your browser using C#. What's not to love?
Exactly. Yeah. Why would you want to do anything else?
Exactly, right? Exactly. And I like that, you all took this idea of, hey, let's use Gitter to communicate, but the Gitter client isn't brilliant. So let's use this technology that we're working in to build a new client for it. I really like that.
Yeah, definitely. It's really cool. And I think that's the thing now. Like you say, we're dealing with the front end technology, and here we are with the front end client that we're, picking holes in. Okay, cool. Well, let's use this technology to build something better. So hopefully we'll get that released soon.
So does this mean then, since you said that a number of the controls and packages were things that you had foreseen a need for in your sort of day-to-day work with Blazor, does this mean then that those packages have been sort of tried and tested in a realistic environment, or are these more sort of thought process and thought experiments? Here's how we could do toast messages in Blazor.
Yeah, the ideas initially were like, okay, I was thinking to myself, right, what do I want to do here? Like, what would be useful to people? And sort of the easiest way for me to work that out would be, okay, well, we're about to start building this new app. What would we use? So I started from there and started playing around with some ideas to see how things went. And then I guess like most things really, I started off trying to just get something to work. And then once I got something to work, I just tried to improve it to make it more useful. So we're now using a few of these components in our project at work. So they're in something that's, going to be in production. Obviously, when we find a shortcoming in one of them, we try to then improve them so that then obviously anybody else who wants to use them in the community can hopefully get the benefit of that. I mean, that's really the whole thing of open source, isn't it? And sort of trying to make improvements for everybody. So hopefully, fingers crossed, they, certainly as time goes on as well, like they'll have more features added to them, and hopefully you'll find them more and more useful. Obviously, anybody can raise any issues they want, any feature requests, things like that. If anyone wants to do PRs to improve stuff, they can. It's it's all open, so that would be great. But yeah, we're trying to battle test them at work as well. And then again, as we find things that we need that aren't there, we'll add them as well along the way. I know we at work, we use a lot of open source stuff, and certainly with this, we feel this is an opportunity to give back, because I think, it's very easy to take from open source and use open source a lot and not necessarily always give something back in return. I don't mean that in a nasty way. Certainly at work, you kind of just want to get the problem solved. Oh, they're cool, there's this package, I'll use it. With this, because Blazor is certainly very new and things like that, we know we're obviously a very, very early adopter of it, but we're trying to help people who are coming behind us by sort of adding any new packages we find.
I like that. Like you say, it's very easy to, not to make it sound bad for people who do this, but it's very easy to take from open source and not give back. And that can be either, the person who's doing it doesn't feel like that they can contribute towards, or maybe they just don't have time. Like you said, maybe it's something that they need to get sold for work, but I was trying to explain to someone, a friend of mine who's not in any way technologically anything. He likes to call himself a typical end user. I'm not sure what that means, but he said to me, well, what's this open source thing then? And I said, it is everybody wins. Nobody loses, everybody wins, because if I use it and I spot something where maybe it could be improved slightly, or maybe my journey with using it isn't brilliant, and then I contribute something back and say, hey folks, this doesn't feel brilliant to me, it caused me an issue when I was trying to use it, here is what I did and here's why I think it caused an issue, that then makes that library, process, function, whatever better for everyone who uses it, or I get told, shut up, you're using it wrong.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is the big thing. And I think you touched on it there as well. I think there is also a lot of people, I think, who would really like to contribute, but they're worried about how they can do that. Or for me, it was, oh my God, I'm going to put all my code out here and I'm just going to get slated because it's terrible or something, that kind of thing. I think initially it can be quite a bit of a daunting experience, putting your code out there so that anybody can see it and, potentially critique it. Mm-hmm. But I think I'd say to anybody who's wondering, I'd just say I think it's one of you just get involved. The open source community is fantastic. And I guess like everything, there's always some negative people, but, the majority of people aren't there. I certainly can say now, as someone who maintains open source packages, I'm happy for any help, because it's anything that can sort of save me a bit of time so I can do something else somewhere else or whatever is always welcome.
Even just reporting when something goes slightly iffy, I think, can really help. Like I said, here's what I did, here's the lines of code I used, here's what I expected it to do, and it didn't quite do that. And maybe it's my misunderstanding of how the system is meant to work. Because even then, you can feed that back into documentation. Well, okay, so we've had 5 users who've said they've used this library and they followed the documentation and it didn't quite run correctly. Maybe we need to change the documentation. Maybe we need to make it more explicit as to what to do. Or maybe we need to make a change to the code because in that situation, we don't want it to do that.
Oh, 100%, definitely. I've definitely had both scenarios that you've mentioned there, where it's been scenarios where, the documentation I've written hasn't been quite explicit enough, and it's led someone sort of into the pit of failure instead of the pit of success. Mm-hmm. And that feedback has meant I could be much better with the documentation, which is fantastic. On the other side of it, I've had someone, not surprisingly, find plenty of blogs and stuff that I've done as well. And it's always great to hear about them and then, be able to get them fixed. The worst thing I think is sometimes where I think for me as an open source maintainer is that you write something and you put it out there, you kind of don't really hear anything. And then you're like, well, is it because it works and it's fine, or is it not working? And that's why no one's saying anything, because they download it doesn't work, and off they go. So I think it's definitely great to get feedback either way, even if you don't want to necessarily contribute code or anything. Just that bug report is invaluable.
Definitely. Or even just reaching out and looking through the issues. And so I know that the .NET team do this. They'll post issues in core CLR, for instance, and to get an idea of how to prioritize these tasks, they ask for people to vote on them. So, leave a little thumbs up or a thumbs down on something just to say whether you would be interested in seeing this fixed in the next version.
Yeah.
Knowing that there is an issue out there that people are having, and maybe you've got two issues and you're thinking, well, I really want to fix this one because this one will be fun to fix, but this other issue is one that people are actually facing.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, there's only ever a finite amount of resource, whether you're doing open source in your spare time or you're a company building open source public like Microsoft does. Ultimately, there's only a certain amount of resource and you have to prioritize somehow. And that is definitely a great way of doing it.
So we're recording this the weekend after Build 2019, and it was only a few weeks ago that Blazor leapt, and I do think it's a proper leap, from 0.9 all the way up to 3.0 Preview 4. Now, I didn't check before I started recording. There may have been a Preview 5 or even a Preview 6, I'm not sure. But considering that the initial public release was only a year ago, the initial development of Blazor has been lightning quick. It does have a bit of a pedigree, doesn't it? Because it goes back to .NET Anywhere, which was an open source thing, and that has its sort of source in Silverlight and things like that. But it has come on so quickly in the last year. Version numbers sometimes don't really mean anything when you go from 0.9 up to 3, but maybe it means a lot to go from 0.9 up to 3. As someone who's been watching that really intently, has that been an exciting ride? Has that been just, oh yeah, they've added this new feature, yeah, whatever? Or has it been, oh my goodness, look at this?
Yeah, it's been amazing. I found Blazor, I think it was late January or early February 2018. And I believe 0.1 came out, I think I'm right in saying about the 22nd of March 2018.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a talk by Steve Sanderson, or the talk by Steve Sanderson, where he showed C# running in the browser using WebAssembly on the .NET Anywhere runtime. And I think he even had the jaws dropping of the upper levels of Microsoft. And, by March, it was into experimental and they were, say version 1 was released. So that was a quick thing anyway, just to go from, I think, that kind of demo to sort of a version 1 of a preview within a few months anyway. But yeah, it just hasn't relented. So I think there's been a Blazor release around once a month-ish since then. But yeah, it's just been feature after feature after feature. So I think one of the cool, really interesting things about the way that Blazor's been developed is that you've got this concept of the Blazor engine, for want of a better way of putting it, which has got all of the component model in it. So that's where you've got all your things like the routing and the component model, the lifecycle, interop, things like that. That's where all of that sits. But that's almost can be used on its own. It's separated from the rendering. Blazor has 2 rendering modes. So it's got a client-side mode and a server-side mode. And in client-side Blazor, that runs on WebAssembly, and you get that classic SPA sort of running on the client. Then you've got server-side Blazor, which is actually running on the server and uses a Signal R connection to the client and just does sort of deltas to update across there. So that was a huge thing. That, I think, was Blazor 0.5 that this concept came out. So you kind of got that very big jump very early on in the architecture. And then sort of going forward after that, you just had constant improvements on top of that. But because this kind of model is separated from the rendering side, it's kind of happening with both rendering options at the same time, which is cool. So these 2 models, the server-side model of this has actually been a sort of committed product for a little while now. That was committed sort of towards the end of 2018, which I think is an amazing feat, really, to say that, you've kind of got this thing that was committed to that early on. Early 18 or early 19, sorry. might be screwing my dates up there. But, within a year, you've kind of already got this committed to product, which was a really big thing. And what happened there was you kind of had these two versions going on because server-side Blazor will ship with .NET Core 3. That kind of took on the package versioning numbers of the .NET previews. Hence, you started then having Preview 1, Preview 2. Client-side Blazor stayed experimental until literally a few weeks ago now, where it was announced that that is now also going to be a committed product and will be released, albeit not with .NET Core 3, but sometime after it. When that happened, Blazor was running on a different numbering system. It carried on the same version that started back on the 22nd of March 2018, with 0.1. So it carried on using those version numbers. At the point it became committed to the next release, they decided to put everything back together. So this is why Blazor jumped from 0.9 to Preview 4. So they were just basically aligning those two versioning systems back together again. I think for people looking from outside, it kind of looks a bit of a weird jump, but basically they're being the two halves of Blazor back together again with that version change. Back to your original question about the speed of development. Yeah, it's been a roller coaster. It's just been new stuff. Really, I think, to be honest with you, recently we went from Preview 4 to Preview 5. Preview 5 was released when build started. And that's probably the first release we've had in, I think, as long as I can remember, really, where there wasn't really anything new as such. It was more just bug fixes where you didn't have a new thing to learn. And obviously, I think that's because we're starting to get ready now for releasing the server-side version of Blazor with .NET Core 3. So there's a bit of stabilization going on. Preview 6, which is the next one, that's kind of back to normal Blazor feature churn out. There's going to be loads of cool stuff in there. There's going to be authentications coming in that one, which I think is something that's been anticipated by the community for quite a long time. We've kind of been able to do authentication, but it's not been anything overly official. But with version 6, we're going to get that, which is awesome. There's a whole plethora of other bits and bobs. We've got directive attributes coming as well, so I've got to look into them myself, to be honest, about how they will function and how they're going to work. We're going to have some multi-product static content stuff. So for a while now, server-side Blazor hasn't been able to load static assets out of NuGet packages. So if you create a NuGet package, like some of mine have JavaScript in them, they don't get imported properly into server-side Blazor projects. But I think with Preview 6, that should now be fixed. So that will start working again as well. There'll be some of the stabilization bits and bobs in there. But yeah, it should be another good, cool release with lots and lots of stuff in it. So yeah, it's just been a rapid fire of features. I don't think I've ever seen something evolve so quickly. But then hopefully this is, a sign of, like say, the pedigree of the project. I mean, Steve Sanderson and the rest of the team who's worked with Ryan and stuff, they're great developers.
Can you see Blazor and WebAssembly sort of taking the place of SPA frameworks and JavaScript, or is it just going to be, here's another tool in your tool belt, and if you want to use it, you can? I know you're very, maybe evangelical, maybe not the right word, but you've come across as really excited, very into the fact that this is a new thing, but taking that hat off,
yes,
and just becoming like a developer rather than a super excited Blazor person. Can you see it sort of taking the place of traditionally of JavaScript, or, is it something that would be more just use it if you want to?
Yeah, like you say, if I take the Blazor hat off for a minute, I think being real about it, I personally don't see JavaScript going anywhere, certainly for a good while. I think at the end of the day, there are plenty of developers out there who like working with JavaScript. They like working with the various JavaScript frameworks that already exist. And a bit like we alluded to earlier, .NET developers moving web forms applications forward and things like that, there needs to be a good reason to do it. And if you're not going to get anything extra by moving to WebAssembly, if you have a perfectly working application that's working with Angular or with Vue, I don't think there's anything that would make you change there and then. I also think that at the moment, WebAssembly is very, very new, and there's still bits that are missing. I mentioned earlier, you can't interrupt directly with browser APIs. You cannot manipulate the DOM. You still have to use JavaScript for those things. These are obviously things that are being worked on. WebAssembly will be able to do those things going forward, but that's going to take time. In terms of general performance, AOTing and things will make a big difference to Blazor specifically. You've still got a bit better performance with JavaScript than you do with WebAssembly, certainly in Blazor at least. So yeah, I think like you say, taking the non-evangelical view of it, I don't think they're going anywhere in the future. And I do see Blazor certainly being another tool in the tool belt. I don't think there will ever be anything in programming that's a silver bullet. And I think it is always a case of picking the right tool for the job. I think if you're in the .NET world, then I think Blazor is something you should definitely be looking at. But yeah, I think if you're not, and you've got JavaScript skills and you're used to that and that's what you work in, then I don't know if I would say anything that could give it good enough reason to change.
So my opinion of that is a case of it's great to know that it exists. And, if you're not a .NET dev, yeah, definitely it's worth knowing that it exists. And even if you are a .NET dev, it's worth sort of looking into just to show, hey, there's this other technology that you may not be using in your production systems because, maybe you can't get the sign off for it, but it'll be worth knowing that it exists so that then you can say, so this is how they're solving this issue. Maybe I can adopt something similar.
Yes, definitely. My view of that very much is at the moment. I think when we're looking, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, things are going to be changing rapidly. I mean, if the pace of Blazor's development continues, in another couple of years, who knows where we'll be. But Blazor also does rely on underlying things, WebAssembly being the main one, Mono as well, because it runs on top of the Mono runtime that's compiled to WebAssembly. So that needs development and things like that. So, and now obviously since build, we now know that we're moving back to a single framework of .NET 5. What will that bring and how will that work? And like I say, I think for the future, I think I'd really struggle to bet against it as being, a real big player. But yeah, I think to say JavaScript would be gone entirely is I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, that's fair enough. So it's not going to be the JavaScript killer. That's fair enough.
I've used JavaScript for a lot of years. It is what it is at the end of the day. And I've used it and enjoyed it. And TypeScript, I've enjoyed it with that. However, my preference would be to stay in C#, and that's why I love Blazor. But yeah, I don't think anything really dies in IT though, does it?
No, that's true.
I mean, there's still COBOL applications running nowadays and things like that. So I don't think anything dies.
No, that's true. You've got to have that backwards compatibility.
Exactly, yeah, definitely.
So where can folks who are listening go to learn more about you and Blazored and all the different projects you're doing? Where's the best place to find out about Chris stuff?
So for me personally, then you're probably best going to my blog, which is chrissainty.com. So that's where I've obviously got my blog posts are going on there and things like that. Then you've got the Blazored org on GitHub. So if you go to my blog, you can get to my GitHub and then from there you can get to Blazored. So that should be easy to find. I think if you're just interested in learning more about Blazor overall, then please come and have a chat with people in Gitter. There's loads of really knowledgeable guys in there and you can get help with anything you need in there. It really is a fantastic community we've got. I really can't speak enough about the quality of people who devote their time and effort to help people with Blazor problems in those rooms. So yeah, outside of that, the other place you can get hold of me is probably on Twitter. So Chris_Sainty.
I guess all that really remains to say is to thank you ever so much for being on the show. Like I said at the beginning, we're all living really busy lives, and I don't know about where you are, but where I am, it's a really nice day.
Yes, it's lovely here. Yeah, blue sky and sunshine.
Yeah, so dragging you presumably into your house to talk about Blazor for an hour rather than letting you go outside and enjoy the sunshine is a bit mean of me, I think.
Oh, not at all. It's my pleasure, and it really doesn't take a lot to get me to talk about Blazor. So.
Well, thank you ever so much for being on the show, Chris. It has been a pleasure to connect with you today and talk to you about Blazor. Thank you ever so much. That was my interview with Chris Sainty. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for some more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .netcore.show/patrons.